Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment to ask you to check me out on Patreon. There are several tiers with great benefits, including ad-free episodes delivered early to patrons. You can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com through Buy Me a Coffee or through e-transfer at crwbaird@gmail.com. Donations help keep the show going. I've also released my first history book, Canada's Main Street, the epic story of the Trans-Canada Highway. You can find it in most bookstores in Canada and through online retailers. You can find the links for Patreon, donating, and my book in my show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. Waves crashed over the deck of the James Carruthers as the crew pushed its engines. Loaded with 375,000 bushels of wheat, they were trying to reach the safety of the coast. They had left Fort William and were traveling to Midland, Ontario, when a great storm descended on them like a beast. And with each wave, the ship fought to stay in one piece. The ship was the largest Canadian vessel on the Great Lakes and was less than a year old, but size doesn't make vessels invincible, as the passengers and the crew of the Titanic had learned a year earlier. The Carruthers' crew of 22 prayed they would make it through the night and avoid a similar fate. Meanwhile, from the safety of their homes, people watched the storm on Lake Huron. They heard the steamer distress whistles in the distance. They helplessly watched as the ship's rockets were fired and lit up the sky in dazzling colors. Then, from land, they watched as the lights of the ship flickered, then vanished. The James Carruthers was gone. But the ship's demise is only part of the tale. I'm Craig Baird, this is Canadian History X, and today I'm sharing the rest of the story and how the ship was a victim of the worst natural disaster to ever hit the Great Lakes. This is the White Hurricane of 1913. The Great Lakes are truly, well, great. They hold 21% of the world's surface fresh water and are more like inland seas that influence the climate of North America. Formed 14,000 years ago by melting ice sheets at the end of the last glacial period, they've shaped the land and the history of the people who inhabit it. 12,000 years ago, First Nations gave them names, things like Gitchagumi, Carignondi, and Canadario. Each name meant something similar, Great Lake. And they became transportation corridors for trading networks that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The Great Lakes gave the First Nations everything they needed, fresh water, ample food, but they also knew that the lakes could take as much as they gave. They could be extremely dangerous for anyone who ventured too far from shore. Plus, snow squalls and thunderstorms could spring up at any moment. But the greatest danger lurked from October to December, and today we call her the Witch of November. The Great Lakes are so large that they can create an intense low atmospheric pressure which pulls Arctic air from the Canadian prairies. You might know this as an Alberta clipper. But when the lake's atmosphere also pulls warm air from the Gulf of Mexico at the same time, it creates the monster known as the Witch of November. The cold air meets the warm lake water, and the two systems create a recipe for disaster. Here is Daniel Rose, Collections and Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Museum, who says when cold air meets warm lake water, the two systems can create a recipe for disaster.
The amazing thing is that there is, in fact, a true danger in the month of November specifically. They call it the Witch of November, quite literally. It is a weather system that will come where you'll get warm air coming off the Gulf of Mexico, meeting cold air coming down from the Arctic and sweeping along the plains. So when those two weather fronts meet at a time where the air conditions might be cool, but the water conditions on the Great Lakes are still fairly temperate, it creates that perfect storm, quite literally, where you can get winds coming from both directions, high waves. It's just a miserable situation, all things considered.
And the First Nations knew that these storms could spring up suddenly and anyone on the lake would be lost. But Europeans failed to listen and paid the price almost immediately. On August 7, 1679, Le Griffin, the first known sailing ship to travel on the upper Great Lakes, launched near Cayuga Island on the Niagara River. She crossed Lake Erie, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan through uncharted waters that only canoes had previously explored. On September 18th, she was traveling back towards Niagara when she vanished. And Le Griffin has never been found. But she wouldn't be the last. It is estimated there are as many as 10,000 shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. And the most treacherous month for shipwrecks? You guessed it, November. And the storms during that month have become legendary. On November 11, 1835, the Witch swept through the Great Lakes claiming 17 ships that were lost, beached, or capsized. 70 years later, on November 27th and 28th, 1905, the Mataafa storm destroyed or damaged nearly 30 vessels and killed 36 people. And 70 years after that, the Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior, taking its entire crew of 29 men with it. The sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald on November 10, 1975, remains one of the most well-known Great Lakes shipwrecks. But the worst storm of all happened in between those disasters, and it brought a vengeance to the lakes not seen before or after. Being able to predict the weather isn't just about knowing when to golf, hike, or if you should take an umbrella. It's about minimizing natural disasters. And that is what the National Weather Service in Canada discovered in 1873. See, they knew in Toronto that a hurricane was coming towards Atlantic Canada, but they had no way to warn the people of Nova Scotia because the telegraph lines were down, and when it hit, it killed 1,000 people. To stop this sort of situation from happening in the future, the Canadian government upgraded its entire storm warning system. By 1876, 24-hour weather forecasts were sent out coast to coast to post offices, telegraph offices, and train stations at 10 a.m., where they were posted on the wall for everybody to see. And before long, the forecast appeared in newspapers. But for decades, they were simple, usually just one line. Sunny, light winds from the south, for example. No satellite maps, no 7-day forecasts. It was imperfect, but it was better than nothing. Because with that information, harbor masters raised flags at their ports, and ship captains on the Great Lakes watched the flags with anticipation to make safe decisions as they transported cargo between the various ports, all in the hopes of avoiding the worst, which is what happened when this simple forecasting system failed. Here is Daniel Rose, who says that in that era, forecasting and communication technology was still in its infancy, making it difficult to know just what was ahead.
The captains who were sailing into that storm had no concept that it was going to be as violent as it was. The way that weather was communicated in 1913 is so different than it is today. There was a main station in Toronto that would radio out all around the Great Lakes what weather predictions were supposed to be. And the way that they got those predictions is they took incoming radio transmissions of storms elsewhere, and they would chart it by hand on a map. So the captains thought they were sailing into no more dangerous than seasonal November winds. And suddenly they're stuck in blinding white, 90-mile-an-hour winds, zero visibility, and more than anything, they're trying to make sure that their crew and their ship doesn't get sucked down to the deep.
The first week of November 1913 was unseasonably warm on the Great Lakes. It had been a stellar shipping season, and the good weather allowed freighters and ships to get extra runs in. When they set out on the extended shipping season, they didn't know that a monster was lurking in the west. An Alberta clipper was speeding down from the Rocky Mountains towards Lake Superior. On the morning of November 6, 1913, it reached the western shores of Lake Superior. However, the weather forecast was for brisk winds and some rain. Across Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan, ships left ports loaded with cargo. Seasoned captains who had spent decades at the helm stared out at the waters while crews readied for the journey. None of them knew what was brewing over them. The Cornell had left Whitefish Point on Lake Superior when she was hit by a powerful northerly gale that was so powerful it drove the ship towards the shore. The captain ordered both anchors dropped and the engines at full speed to fight the powerful system and keep the ship from the shallow waters. For the next 23 hours, her propellers battled to keep the ship from the shore. The Cornell's battle was far from over, but she was the first ship to meet the monster. And soon, there would be more ships fighting for their lives. As the sun rose on November 7th, the storm that almost claimed the Cornell was raging over Lake Superior. Weather reports for the other lakes called for increased winds and falling temperatures over the next 24 hours, which greatly underestimated the power of Mother Nature. The storm was slowly making its way east, but Lake Superior is so large that it gave those on the far eastern side a false sense of calm. Things for them didn't seem that bad. Captain Chauncey Nye of the John A. McGean was getting one more run on the season on Lake Superior. The trip was expected to take a month as they stopped to unload coal for the winter at various stops. But Captain Nye hoped to be home by December 16th to celebrate his anniversary with his wife Eve. He knew a storm was coming, so he traveled near the shore for safety. It was what any experienced captain would do. By 10 a.m. on November 7th, all 112 weather stations on Lake Superior, Lake Huron, and Lake Michigan were hoisting a red flag with a black center and a triangular maritime pennant below that. Now, in the days before widespread wireless communication, when most ships didn't even have a telegraph station, flags and lanterns were how ships were warned of an incoming storm. And this signal was the second highest warning. It indicated there was an approaching storm with 89-kilometer-hour winds from the southwest. Once the sun went down, the flags were replaced with a red lantern over a white one. But by then, the winds on Lake Superior were at 97 kilometers an hour with gusts as high as 130 kilometers an hour, which were producing monster waves. And as ships did their best to stay ahead of the storm through the night, the Witch of November barreled east. On the morning of November 8th, the storm was upgraded to a severe storm by the Weather Service. It was now centered over eastern Lake Superior, but had grown so large that it covered the entire lake. This means it covered 82,000 square kilometers and was larger than Ireland. Gale wind flags were raised at more than 100 ports as dozens of ships raced to ports or havens to wait out the worst of the storm. But many captains and crews didn't even want to be out on the water. These experienced sailors knew the dangers of the Witch of November, but ship owners pushed for one more trip, one more bit of cargo to pad those bank accounts. They told captains to ignore the forecasts, and if they wanted to keep their jobs, they had to get out of the water and head out. Here is Daniel Rose, Collections and Programs Coordinator for the Great Lakes Museum. He states that the ships of the era were simply not designed for the looming disaster.
It's most likely that they would have remained in port and not chanced it if the season hadn't been as lucrative as it had been. Of course, with a lot of the bulk goods that are carried on the Great Lakes, iron, wheat, coal at that time, those are resources that are always in high demand. And it definitely incentivized captains to take larger loads, take on a little bit more risk, and the larger loads puts more strain on the ship. And then when you're faced with that weather, it's more likely that there's damage to the vessel and danger to crew.
The SS Hydrus was sailing towards the St. Clair River, which is the pathway to Lake Erie, when the witch caught her. Waves rose 10 meters high and hit the ship, eventually swamping the deck. Like a hand reaching up from the depths, she was pulled down by the waves into the murky waters and was never to be seen again. The storm was moving east, and the edge of it hit Lake Michigan, where 52-meter-long L.C. Waldo was battling the waves. She was 90 kilometers northeast of the Keweenaw Peninsula when a 15-meter high wave slammed into her. The wheelhouse took most of the hit, and the force bent the steel floor in the compass room. It also swept the wheelman out of the room and destroyed 3 walls on the level below. The captain wasn't going to risk it, so he ordered the ship to turn around and head to the safety of the peninsula. But as she did, the rudders failed and left the ship dead in the water as waves pushed her into the rocks of Manitou Island. The rocks shredded her hull as great cracks tore through the deck. But this was a blessing in disguise. If she stayed on the rocks, she would not sink. So the captain ordered the ship flooded to weigh her down and prevent the waves from washing her out. The chief engineer then ran the ship full power to wedge her further into the rocks. Meanwhile, Captain Nye had not been deterred by the clearly posted storm warnings as he sailed out of Sandusky, Ohio into Lake Erie a day earlier. He knew that a great northwest gale was ravaging Lake Superior when he headed out, and he chose to run the McGean along the Michigan shore, hoping to be safe from the worst of the storm. But now, the Johnny McGean was struggling against the blizzard conditions and waves that were at times 11 meters high. By now it was nighttime and a wave hit the keel and bent it to a 45-degree angle. The ship lost one of her propeller blades, and like the LC Waldo, she was dead in the water. Adrift, waves slammed into her, taking out the wheelhouse and the stove in the engine room. The holds quickly flooded and the crew had only moments to whisper their last goodbyes before she was lost beneath the waves. The McGean was last seen by residents watching from Terrace Point, Michigan. Captain Nye and his wife Eve never celebrated that anniversary in December. Meanwhile, on Lake Michigan, the Plymouth, which was an American barge and one of the smaller ships at 64 meters in length, was battling the waves. It had left port with a cargo of cedar posts and was being towed by the tug James H. Martin from Menominee, Michigan to Lake Huron. The Plymouth was one of the oldest on the lakes and had entered service in 1854 and even saw action in the American Civil War. On the Plymouth were Captain Alex Larson, 6 crew, and a U.S. Marshal who was on board due to various lawsuits against the owners of the ship. And while being towed through Lake Michigan, both ships were unaware they were heading straight into the path of the storm. The tugboat towed the Plymouth to the safest waters nearby, which were located at the mouth of Green Bay. The tug line was then cut and the little boat left to seek shelter 19 kilometers away. If they had remained connected, there was a real danger the waves would take both of them down. The Plymouth dropped anchor and, like so many other ships on the lakes that night, waited for the storm to pass. As the sun rose on November 9th, conditions on Lake Superior and Huron appeared to be relatively returning to normal. The Isaac Merritt Scott was heading out of Milwaukee loaded with $22,000 in coal, and as the low pressure that sat over Lake Superior traveled northeast and away from the lakes, winds suddenly subsided and the barometer started to rise. Weather forecasters and crews on ships hoped this would be the end of the storm. The Isaac Merritt Scott took advantage of the nice weather and was seen by the H.B. Hawgood steaming ahead on that day. The ship was never seen afloat again. That's because the captain had no idea that a new storm from the south was traveling up the eastern seaboard of the United States. And through the morning, the storm slowly moved north and caused a counterclockwise rotation of the system when it collided with the storm over Lake Superior and Lake Huron, causing wind speeds to increase dramatically as massive waves formed. Lake Superior and Lake Huron were walloped by this weather bomb system with hurricane-force winds. On Lake Huron, ships attempted to escape by heading to the southern shore, but wind gusts of 140 kilometers an hour made crossing the lake dangerous, if not impossible. The SS Regina was traveling north on Lake Huron from Port Edward, Ontario, when the storm descended upon her. Captain McConkey decided to get her into a safe harbor, but the high winds and large waves pushed her away from the shore. With no choice, he anchored 11 kilometers offshore and ordered his crew to abandon ship. The SS Regina couldn't be saved. The crew in a tiny boat tried to make it to shore as the storm was sinking giant ships with ease. Elsewhere, Captain Lyons at the J.H. Sheetal was trying to keep his ship from vanishing in the storm. Each wave shook the ship and the crew expected the worst at any moment. Lyons wrote, quote, "The bell rang for supper at 3:45 p.m., which was prepared and the table set when a gigantic sea mounted our stern, flooding the fantail, sending torrents of water through the passageways of each side of the cabin, concaving the cabin, breaking the windows in the after cabin, washing away our provisions out of the refrigerator and practically destroying them all, leaving us with one ham and a few potatoes. Volumes of water came down on the engine through the upper skylights, and at times there were from 4 to 6 feet of water in the cabin." In heavy snow, high waves, and near zero visibility conditions, Captain Lyons managed to turn the ship multiple times on Lake Huron to maintain a course that kept the waves at her stern, hoping to keep her afloat. And across the lake on Manitoulin Island, the LC Waldo was still wedged in the rocks. 22 men, 2 women, and a dog huddled together, soaking wet with no food as temperatures dropped to near freezing. To keep everyone warm, the chief engineer grabbed a tub from the captain's quarters, as well as fire buckets to create a crude stove and chimney. They broke all of the furniture to start a fire. It wasn't much, but it was enough warmth to prevent hypothermia. And then, luck shone on them. Before the ship was encased in ice, the George Stevenson happened to be traveling nearby and saw her distress flag. The crew sent a message to a local lightkeeper who relayed that alert to a life-saving station nearby. One of the crew members of the LC Waldo wrote, "We saw a grotesque ghostly shape top a wave, poise on its crest for a moment, then sink out of sight. As the wave slipped under it and went racing on, the object again came into view. It was nearer and the mystery was explained, and with understanding the watchers felt warming blood leap into their chilled veins." The crew members of the ship, some wearing towels around their head for warmth, others had socks for mittens, were loaded into the life-saving boat. And through a miracle, there were no casualties. They had survived 96 hours shipwrecked in the storm. But not all crews were as fortunate. The SS Argus was battling Lake Huron when it was hit by 2 large waves. One hit the bow, the other the stern. Captain Walter Eiler on a nearby ship watched it happen and said he saw the Argus being lifted into the air by the waves as she cracked into 2 pieces. He said later, the Argus seemed to crumple like an eggshell. Then she was gone. And she took with her the entire crew. Daniel Rose says that when crews got into lifeboats, it truly was a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire.
At this point, the Great Lakes are not truly open for large-scale bulk carrying. So what you get are ships that are designed not for the conditions they might experience, but to fit through the locking system that connects the different lakes to allow cargo to be brought through. When you have winds coming from both directions that generate these rogue waves, it's almost the perfect conditions to snatch up that steel body like you described and break it, because it's quite a bit more fragile than maybe an ocean liner would have been, because those are built for much more substantial storms on the open seas.
The SS Hydrus, the sister ship of the Argus, was also lost in the storm, as was the Leafield, sailing on Lake Superior, which sank in the night along with the 18 crew on board. As the sun dawned on Lake Superior on November 10th, the Cornell had been fighting hard against the storm for 4 days. At 5 a.m., a huge wave crashed into her side and tore away the aft cabin and destroyed doors and windows as crew quarters and the galley filled with water. Assistant Engineer Earl Rattray wrote, "We're nearly broken to, anchors gone, windlass a wreck, house stove in, furniture wrecked, and just a cripple from stem to stern." At one point, First Assistant Jack Kittle said, "Goodbye, kiddies," as he waited for the cold waters of the lake to rush in. He truly believed he would never see his children again. And things looked dire as the storm moved east and began to cause a lake-effect blizzard. These are created when the temperature is low enough to keep precipitation frozen and can include lightning and thunder and, in rare cases, tornadoes. In 1913, it wasn't that dramatic, but it did drop 40 centimeters of snow around Lake Superior and Lake Huron, and some snowdrifts were 1.8 meters high. Here's Daniel Rose, Collections and Programs Coordinator for the Great Lakes Museum, and he explains just how the storm prevented many communication and rescue attempts.
So a lot of those modes of communication that they would have relied on weren't even an option. To add insult to injury, not only did you not have those new forms of communication, there was so much snow on the ground, I believe 30 centimeters in parts of Ontario and the northeastern United States, where it was so thick that you could not even walk through to manually relay a warning or to get help. So those men on the lakes were left quite literally to their own devices.
And the storm continued to claim lives. On Lake Huron, sailors saw a ship floating bottom side up. The entire ship was coated in ice and could not be identified. At first, it was believed to be the Charles S. Price, but it was soon identified as the SS Regina. By the end of the day, the ship was at the bottom of the lake. Around that same time, the tugboat James H. Martin returned where it had left the Plymouth anchored 2 days earlier. They found no ship, just open water. The Plymouth was gone. Meanwhile, on Lake Superior, by 10 p.m. that day, the Cornell finally reached Toledo, Ohio. The battered ship's crew breathed a sigh of relief. They had fought for 68 hours and survived. First Assistant Jack Kittle could see his children again. Assistant Engineer Earl Rattray said, "We've got our smokestacks yet, and that's about all that was left on the deck, and there certainly was no boat any nearer gone than we and came through." After 5 days, the storm finally moved towards eastern Canada, and without the lakes powering the system, it quickly lost strength. But it left behind a path of destruction that became a legendary tale told by old mariners at bars across the Great Lakes. 19 ships were severely damaged, another 12 lost, along with 250 killed. Financial losses were $5 million, with a total loss of cargo of 68,000 tons. And as the sun shone above the snow that now blanketed the Great Lakes, along the beaches, locals began the grim process of looking for bodies that littered the shore. On November 12th, 3 men were found lashed to a lifeboat from the John A. McGean. The men were covered in ice and were identified by papers found in their pockets. 2 more were found 2 days later. 5 crew members from the SS Hydrus made it into a lifeboat before their ship went down. Sadly, they were found days later, frozen to death. The crew who had escaped the SS Regina and lifeboats were found after the storm. None lived to tell the tale, as 2 were found dead on a capsized lifeboat, while another 10 were found on a beach nearby. Daniel Rose, Collections and Programs Coordinator for the Great Lakes Museum, on just how powerful the storm was and the destruction it created for the ships on the lakes.
If you can imagine launching a lifeboat in those conditions to go over to another ship or to look for wreckage or remains, survivors, there was one ship in particular that launched a lifeboat, and those men were never seen again. That was the only avenue that they had to help each other, and it's part of the reason why it was so tragic and so deadly.
On November 22nd, a bottle was discovered floating on Lake Michigan. Inside was a note from Marshal Chris Keenan, who had been on the Plymouth. It stated, "Dear wife and children, we were left up here in Lake Michigan by McKinnon, Captain James H. Martin Tug, at anchor. He went away and never said goodbye or anything to us. Lost 1 man yesterday. We've been out in a storm 40 hours. Goodbye, dear ones. I might see you in heaven. Pray for me. P.S. I felt so bad I had another man write for me. Goodbye. Forever." Weeks later, on December 11, 1913, the body of Captain A. MacArthur of the Isaac Merritt Scott was found still wearing a life preserver on a beach near Southampton, Ontario. Later, a lifeboat was found 37 kilometers out on the lake. None of the 28 crew from that ship had survived. 6 months after the storm, the body of Edward McConkie, the captain of the Regina, washed up near Goderich, Ontario. And since his body was found so long after the others, it's believed that he ordered his crew to abandon the ship, and like many other captains on doomed vessels, he chose to go down with his ship. The White Hurricane claimed ships and souls, and became part of the region's folklore as people talked about when the lakes would reveal their secrets. The SS Argus, which broke in two, was discovered in 1972. She rests upside down 76 meters beneath the waves of Lake Huron. The Isaac Merritt Scott was lost for 63 years until it was located by divers a few years later in 1976. She was half buried in mud 55 meters below the water and resting upside down. It was believed a rogue wave hit her, causing her to roll and sink immediately. The Johnny McGean remained lost for about a decade more until she was found in 1985. A year later, the SS Regina was found upside down under 24 meters of water. Thousands of artifacts were taken from the ship, including hundreds of intact bottles of scotch and champagne. Then the lakes held on to their secrets for almost 30 years until the summer of 2015, when the wreck of the SS Hydrus was found 48 meters below the waters of Lake Huron. Her bow was twisted at a 45-degree angle, likely hit by a monster wave. Daniel Rose states that one extra trip was sometimes too lucrative to ignore, but taking larger loads late in the season could be dangerous.
The ship was perfectly intact except for her bow, which, due to either the weight of ice that was stuck to this bow or the speed of the winds, the bow part of the ship was twisted 45 degrees relative to the rest of the body of the ship. And to just imagine those conditions that would have caused that wrecking, it defies imagination and really reminds us that the Great Lakes are a ferocious beast.
Everything else was intact, including the ship's wheelhouse and telegraph room. Encrusted in zebra mussels, she still holds the iron ore that was meant for a port on one last trip before the White Hurricane hit. And yet, some ships from that great storm are still missing. The James Carruthers and the Plymouth still rest under the water, hidden from view and waiting to be discovered. I would like to thank the Great Lakes Museum and Daniel Rose for taking the time to talk to me about the White Hurricane of 1913. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com. Or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.